Alright, we are back with another total drama video. Now, this is an interesting idea I had for a bit of a while, finally getting around to doing it. I'll be going through every player that has either been eliminated and come back into the game, or players that weren't initially in the game but entered at a later point, and simulate how the rest of that season would have played out had that player not re entered the game. Now, the main wrinkle for all this is seasons where there are multiple players that re enter the game at various points. For those cases, I'll be simulating the season as if players that re entered the game after that player in question did not return the game as well. However, for players that re entered the game before the player in question, I will be playing it out as if those earlier players did re enter the game. So, for example, when I talk about Courtney from Total Drama Action, I am playing it out as if Owen does not re enter the game. But when I talk about Owen from Total Drama Action, will be playing it out as if Courtney had re entered the game as she did in episode 13. I hope that makes sense. One other thing is that I will not be including players who quit, or medevaced, or were eliminated outside a traditional vote. I might make a future video discussing those situations, but for this list, we'll just be focusing on players re entering the game. So for this list, there are 8 players to talk about, 6 of which were eliminated but later re entered the game, and 2 of which were not initially on the season but entered the game at a later point. And I'll be going through them in the order in which they re entered the game. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first player we'll be talking about is Eva, who returned at the merge in Total Drama Island. And I'll just say up front that both the returnees from Total Drama Island don't really affect too much, and especially in the case of Eva, as she was immediately voted out after re-entering the game, I feel like not much changes as a result. So that one, I would say, largely remains the same as normal. Next up, we have Izzy, who also returned at the merge until Drama Island, and we have a bit more to talk about, but really, it doesn't really affect the game that much either. Izzy wasn't super instrumental in the gameplay during the time she was in it. While she did join Heather's alliance in the actual show, that wasn't really enough to counteract the target Heather had during the early merge. The only thing I say might change things would be the gender split and the push by Duncan to create a guys' alliance, as the men would enter the merge 5-5 instead of 7-5 in the actual show. But assuming all the trend stuff still happens, the men would be down in numbers anyway, so that push may still have happened. But like I said, not much really changes if Izzy didn't return to the game, so I would say this one is also playing out the same. Now we're jumping a bit forward to Total Drama Action, but again, we're talking about Izzy, who comes back in episode 7 of Total Drama Action. She did technically survive a vote in episode 9, where the bottom two were Lindsay and Justin before DJ quit the game, only to be voted out in episode 11. So without Izzy as a buffer, I think what would have happened in episode 13 without Courtney just accelerates one more round, where I think Justin convinces Beth and Lindsay to vote out Owen, which I think is a suboptimal move in my opinion, as it means Justin would be the next to go if the Grips lost another challenge. And if this is assuming the merge still happens in episode 16, as it does in the actual show, this would leave us with only 5 people left in the game in a 3-person jury. I think to keep things reasonable and consistent with the show, with a 7-person merge, the merge would probably happen after the Owen vote, allowing both Justin and Heather to survive one more round, but just for fairness, I guess we can quickly break down the alternative. So I guess in that case, with this 5-person jury, Duncan would go at 5. At 4, we could get a tie with LaShawn and Harold on one side, Beth and Lindsay on another. However, I think the most likely scenario is that Lashana convinces Beth and Lindsay to turn on Harold. At 3, if Beth or Lindsay win immunity, they take each other, and I assume Beth would win in this case. If Lashana wins, whoever she takes ends up winning. But returning to the 7-person merge scenario, I don't think much would change due to Izzy not coming back. The biggest change to the timeline would come from other players not returning based on the criteria for the video. But speaking of which, we get to the next person to return to the game, that being Courtney, who comes back in episode 13 of Total Drama Action during the final 8. Now, we're getting to a scenario now that really changes the game. So, first off, if Courtney doesn't return, I think Owen still gets voted out by the Grips, assuming the same challenge results happen. While Justin's grip on Beth and Lindsay was loosening by that point, I think he still would have convinced Beth and Lindsay to vote out Owen, and I don't think Owen would push that hard to cut Justin. And I think Heather would still be voted out by the gaffers the next round, assuming since now the players wouldn't see the video of Lashana trashing them on Courtney's PDA. But then at the merge is where things get more interesting. Firstly, Duncan would still be targeted by the women for being a threat, except now Courtney isn't there as a vote to save Duncan, and more crucially, isn't there to flip Harold, who was seriously considering voting out Duncan at that elimination ceremony. So because of that, I think Duncan is voted out 4 to 2. So obviously that is a radical departure from the actual show, and we get to a final five of Beth and Lindsay, Harold and Lashana, and Justin. Now the immediate thought is they would vote out Justin next, but I actually think Justin would fight to be a swing vote in this case. Now it's possible he could try siding with Beth and Lindsay, but actually I think the more likely option is he goes to Harold and Lashana to break up Beth and Lindsay. I think Harold and Lindsay are people he could talk to from a purely strategic perspective and convince them that Beth and Lindsay are big jury threats. If that works, then they most likely vote out Lindsay at Final Five. Now, unfortunately for Justin, I think the other three would gang up on him at four to take him out, leaving us with the final three of Beth, Harold, and Lashana. If either Harold or Lashana win immunity, they take each other, and assuming it's a jury vote, Lashana probably wins unanimously. If Beth wins immunity, I think she takes Harold to the end. While she has a longer relationship with Lashana, I think she was closer to Harold towards the end game of action. And in that case, I think Beth wins 3 to 1, although Justin could force a tie if he wanted to. So, as you can see here, we get a radically different outcome if Courtney doesn't return to the game. So, obviously, this was a bit of a more interesting case. Next up, we have Owen, who comes back in episode 21 of Total Drama Action during the final five as a mole for production. Now, for this example, I'm going to assume that Lindsay still accidentally votes herself out of the game. In the actual show, Owen was recruited by Beth and Lindsay to vote out Duncan, only to throw away his vote onto Courtney, who won immunity. So he wasn't that relevant to the vote there, so it's safe to assume that the same thing would happen. We would then get to a final four where we have Duncan, Courtney, Beth, and Harold. At first glance, it seems like we could be getting a tie situation with Duncan and Courtney being a voting block and Beth and Harold being a counter alliance. Now, in the actual show, Courtney did attempt to form an alliance with Beth around this point, only for that to get to crumble rather quickly. And we also saw Courtney attempt to date Duncan again, only for him to get bogged down by her self righteousness and that contract that she wrote up. So it's actually possible Courtney could get voted out instead, giving us a Duncan, Beth, Harold final three. If Beth or Harold win final three immunity, I think they would take each other. And in that scenario, I think Beth would win, getting every vote except Courtney and possibly Justin. If Duncan wins immunity, I think he takes Harold, seeing him as easier to beat, and I think Duncan would win, even if Beth and Lindsay vote for Harold. So really, I don't think this is too different from the real life scenario, as either way, I feel like one of the two people that won on the actual show would probably still win if Owen didn't come back in the game. The main difference probably would be that Harold would get a little bit further, as Owen was a big reason that he was voted out in the actual show. So at least there's that. Next up, we're moving on to Duncan, who came back in episode 13 of Total Drama World Tour during the final 10. And I feel like this is the other pretty big change from the actual real life case that happened on the show, sort of like Courtney not coming back in action. So, firstly, no Duncan means no love triangle. Noah still gets voted out first, as Duncan had nothing to do with that, considering the circumstances. And while Duncan made a deal with Alejandro to not vote him out during the Tyler round, I still think Alejandro would have cut Tyler here, as he would have viewed Owen as easier to manipulate. But then we get to episode 16, where Team Amazon loses the challenge. Since there's no love triangle, Gwen isn't a pariah, and Team Amazon has zero reason to keep Heather. So I actually think Heather gets voted out here. And then we get to the merge, which only has 6 people in it. Despite what I did for Izzy in action, I decided to not create an alternate timeline, as there is an actual season, Revenge of the Island, that had a 6-person merge, which I can live with more so than a 5-person merge. But anyway, aside from Heather being taken out much earlier than she did on the actual show, there are other key differences in this Duncanless scenario. For one, Owen would be much less suspicious of Alejandro, as Duncan was the one playing those seeds on the show. So I think Alejandro would keep Owen around in favor of targeting Team Amazon, who by this point have a 4-2 majority. I think he would try to latch on to Courtney and Gwen to break up the Cody Sierra duo. Now, obviously, in this scenario, Courtney isn't as desperate to be with Alejandro as she isn't shaken by the love triangle, but I think he can charm her enough to do just that. So, with that, plus Cody's vote, as Cody wanted to get rid of Sierra at multiple points, I think he can vote out Sierra most likely, also securing Cody's loyalty in the process. At Final 5, I think Alejandro sort of flips to team up with Owen to target Gwen, someone that isn't useful for his game at this point. But I think at that point, Gwen would recognize Alejandro's game and try putting a vote together against Alejandro. Courtney would be the swing vote in this scenario, and without the love triangle clouding her judgment, I think she would ultimately side with Gwen and Cody to take out Alejandro. And then at the final four, I think they vote out Owen due to him being a big threat. And through that, we get a Cody, Courtney, Gwen final three. I think Gwen and Cody take each other, they win final three immunity. I think Gwen recognizes that Courtney would be tougher to beat in a jury vote. And I think Gwen wins that, getting every vote except Sierra. If Courtney wins immunity, I think she also takes Cody, where I think she wins the season, getting every vote except, well, Sierra. So I think again this is another radically different scenario, probably even more different than what we got in the action scenario with Courtney. So, but it sort of shows what could have been. But obviously Duncan came back in the game and changed things up. So there's that. And with that, there are two other players to talk about here, but I'm not going to lie, they're not nearly as interesting to talk about as some of the other ones we already mentioned, but I'll just run through them quickly. We have Blaney entering the game in episode 19 of Total Drama World Tour right at the merge, and this one doesn't change much. I mean, Blaney contributed very little to the actual gameplay of the season. She was kind of useless and was sort of voted out like relatively quickly after entering the game. She didn't really do much to really change the course of the season. I feel like the game would play out largely similarly if she didn't enter. And then the other scenario to talk about is Dakota, who comes back a bit before the merge of Total Drama Revenge of the Island after being voted out second. And again, this is another one that doesn't really do much. I mean, she did very little in the game. Much of what happened to her after re entering was her getting mutated and turning into Dakota Zoid. And she was voted out relatively quickly. Now, I know Scott did play his immunity idol and to vote out Dakota, but I feel like even without that, I feel like he would just pick another target instead. I don't really think much changes without Dakota re-entering the game, so there's that. And there we go. That will do it for this video. Now, obviously, we did see several cases change, like assuming certain people didn't return, but honestly, there were plenty of other cases where the game didn't really change. So I thought that was still an interesting exercise to run through. If you enjoy this content, be sure to like and subscribe. If you're interested in more of this social strategy talk, I talk about Survivor and Big Brother and other reality shows, feel free to subscribe to my other channel, Survivor Gumball. A lot of great stuff there. Of course, on this channel, there are other great stuff coming in the future, a lot of fun ideas that I had. But for now, that is the video. See ya.